On a Tuesday morning in late October of 1951, Dale Prescott stood at the edge of a gravel county road in Hardin County, Iowa, and watched what remained of his professional reputation sink slowly into the earth. Not metaphorically, literally. The 1951 International Harvester L11 flatbed he'd been contracted to haul grain for the Hardin County Cooperative had gone off the shoulder of the road sometime after midnight, slid down a 12-foot embankment, crossed a drainage ditch at the bottom, and buried itself to the frame rails in the black bottomland mud of Elk Creek. The truck weighed 4 tons empty. It was carrying 6 tons of shelled corn when it went in. The mud beneath it was not mud in any ordinary sense. It was the accumulated silt of 100 years of Iowa floods, black and thick and cold, and it had closed around the axles and the frame and the running boards like a fist. Dale Prescott was 31 years old and had built his hauling business from a single-used truck he'd bought in 1946, with money he'd saved working construction after the war. By 1951, he had 3 trucks, 2 drivers, and a contract with the co-op that paid him more in a month than his father had made in a year. He was the kind of man who wore a clean shirt to a job site and shook hands firmly and always had a number ready when someone asked him what something would cost. He was proud of what he'd built, and he had every reason to be. And now his best truck was in a ditch, and the co-op's grain was sitting in a flooded field, and the morning light was coming up gray and cold over the flat Iowa landscape and making everything look worse than it already was. He'd called Merv Sievert first. Merv ran the only heavy equipment operation in the county, and Merv had arrived at 6:30 in the morning with a D6 Caterpillar dozer and a confidence that Dale found reassuring right up until the moment the dozer's tracks began spinning in the mud at the edge of the embankment, and Merv had to back it away before it joined the truck in the ditch. The ground was saturated for 30 feet in every direction from the truck. The weight of the dozer was too much. It would sink before it could pull. Merv stood at the edge of the road and looked down at the truck and said he could bring in a crane from Eldora, but the crane would need solid ground to set up on, and there was no solid ground within reach of the truck. He said he'd seen trucks come out of situations like this, but not many, and not without a lot of work. He said he'd make some calls. Let me tell you about what those calls produced, because you need to understand how thoroughly the professional options had been exhausted before the rest of this story makes sense. Merv reached a salvage outfit from Webster City that had pulled vehicles from the Cedar River bottoms before. They arrived on Wednesday with a winch truck rated at 20,000 pounds of line pull and a block and tackle setup that could theoretically double that. They rigged to a telephone pole on the road above the embankment, and they pulled. The cable went tight as a guitar string, and the winch motor screamed, and the telephone pole leaned 4 inches toward the ditch, and the truck did not move. Not an inch. The mud had gotten another day to set up around it, and the suction holding the frame was something you could feel in your chest when the cable went tight. The salvage foreman, a heavy-set man named Chuck Radcliffe, who had been pulling vehicles for 20 years, walked down the embankment in rubber boots and knelt in the mud and put his hand under the running board and came back up, shaking his head. He said the suction alone was probably holding at 30,000 pounds. He said they'd need to break the suction before they could move it, and to break the suction they'd need to get water or air underneath the frame, and to do that, they'd need equipment they hadn't brought. He said he'd come back Thursday with a hydraulic pump and some hose. Thursday, the hydraulic pump moved the truck 3 feet before the hose coupling failed and the pump lost prime, and the truck settled back into a new position that was, if anything, worse than the original. The frame had rotated slightly, and the front axle was now angled downward into the mud at a 15-degree angle. Chuck Radcliffe stood in the mud and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then he said that in his professional opinion, the truck was not coming out without a crane, and the crane was not coming in without a road, and building a road into that bottomland would cost more than the truck was worth. He said he was sorry. He said it with the flat certainty of a man who had seen enough lost causes to recognize one, and Dale Prescott, standing on the road above him in his clean shirt that was no longer clean, heard the certainty in his voice and felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the October air. That was Thursday afternoon. Let me tell you about Friday morning, because that's when Emmett Gustafson came down his lane. Let me tell you about Emmett Gustafson, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. Emmett was 67 years old in 1951. Though he looked older, the way men who have spent 50 years in Iowa weather tend to look older. He farmed 280 acres on the north side of Elk Creek, land his father had broken in 1903, and he had worked that land through the drought years and the depression years and the war years without complaint and without drama, and without ever once suggesting to anyone that farming was harder than it needed to be. He was not a man who talked much. His neighbors knew him as the kind of man who showed up when you needed help and left before you could thank him, and who never mentioned it afterward. He had a wife named Eunice and 2 grown sons who had both gone to work in Waterloo and who called on Sundays, and he had a farm that was paid for and a barn that was tight and a woodlot that he managed the way his father had managed it, which was carefully and with an eye toward what it would look like in 20 years. He also had, in a machine shed at the back of his property, a 1929 Fordson Model F tractor that he had purchased new from a dealer in Iowa Falls in 1929 for $395 and had been running ever since. Let me tell you about that tractor because the tractor is as much a part of this story as Emmett is. The Fordson Model F was not a complicated machine. Henry Ford had designed it to be simple enough that a farmer could maintain it himself, and simple enough that it would keep running under conditions that would stop a more sophisticated machine. It had a 4-cylinder engine that produced about 12 horsepower at the belt and somewhere between 9 and 10 at the drawbar. By 1951 standards, it was ancient. The new tractors coming out of the John Deere and International Harvester plants were putting out 40, 50, 60 horsepower. They had hydraulics and live PTO shafts and rubber tires and operator stations with some protection from the weather. The Fordson had steel wheels with spade lugs, a magneto ignition, a vaporizing carburetor that ran on kerosene after the engine warmed up on gasoline, and a 2-speed transmission that Emmett could have taken apart and reassembled blindfolded. He had replaced the magneto in 1934 and the carburetor needle valve in 1941 and had rebuilt the engine in 1947 with parts he'd ordered from a supplier in Chicago. The tractor did not look like much. The gray paint had gone to rust in patches, and the front wheels had a slight wobble that Emmett had never seen fit to correct because it didn't affect how the machine worked. But it ran. It always ran. And Emmett knew things about how it ran that no one who hadn't operated it for 22 years could have known. He had watched the salvage operation from his lane for 3 days. Not intrusively. He had his own work to do, and he did it. But his lane ran along the north fence of his property, and the embankment where the truck had gone in was visible from the lane, and when he drove past in his pickup, he watched what was happening with the quiet attention of a man who had spent his life solving problems by watching them first. He had watched the dozer spin its tracks. He had watched the winch cable go tight and the telephone pole lean. He had watched Chuck Radcliffe walk down the embankment in his rubber boots. And on Thursday evening, after Chuck Radcliffe had driven away, and Dale Prescott was sitting in his truck on the county road with the engine running and the heater on and his hands on the steering wheel going nowhere, Emmett had stood at his fence line for a while and thought about what he'd seen and what he knew and what might be done about it. On Friday morning, he drove his pickup down his lane and turned south on the county road and pulled up behind Dale Prescott's truck, which was still there because Dale had nowhere else to be. He got out and walked up to Dale's window, and Dale rolled it down. Emmett looked at the truck in the ditch and then looked at Dale. He said, "I've got a Fordson and a set of logging chains and a snatch block. I think I can get your truck out." Dale looked at him for a moment. He knew who Emmett was, the way you know everyone in a county of 12,000 people. He said, "Merv Sievert's D6 couldn't get it out." Emmett nodded. He said, "I know." I watched. He said, "Merv was trying to pull it. I'm not going to pull it." Dale said, "What are you going to do?" Emmett said, "I'm going to lift it and walk it out." Dale looked at the truck in the mud and then looked back at Emmett and said he didn't understand. Emmett said, "I know. You want me to show you? Now, let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time someone offered you a solution to a problem that every expert had already declared impossible, and offered it not with bluster or salesmanship, but with the quiet matter-of-fact certainty of someone who simply knew what they were talking about?" Because that's what Emmett Gustafson was doing on that Friday morning. He wasn't selling anything. He wasn't performing confidence. He was just a 67-year-old farmer in a canvas jacket and a seed cap and rubber boots who had looked at a problem for 3 days and thought he understood it. Dale Prescott, who had spent 3 days watching professionals fail, said yes. Chuck Radcliffe was still in the county. He was staying at the hotel in Eldora while he arranged for the crane he'd mentioned, which was going to cost Dale Prescott more money than Dale wanted to think about. Merv Sievert had called him that morning to tell him about the old farmer who thought he could pull the truck out with a Fordson, and Chuck had driven out to the county road because he wanted to see this, and because he was a professional, and he was not going to let an old farmer with a 20-year-old tractor do something that his equipment couldn't do without at least being present to explain why it wouldn't work. He arrived at the site at 9 in the morning and stood on the road shoulder with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched Emmett Gustafson back the Fordson down his lane on its steel lug wheels, the engine chuffing and popping in the cold air, trailing a set of logging chains that clanked against the gravel. Chuck Radcliffe looked at the tractor and then looked at Merv Sievert, and the look between them said everything that looks between professionals say when an amateur shows up with the wrong equipment. He said, "That thing's got maybe 10 horsepower at the drawbar. My winch was pulling at 20,000 pounds, and the truck didn't move." Merv said, "I know." Chuck said, "This is going to be embarrassing for the old man." Merv said he'd thought about saying something but figured it wasn't his place. Chuck said, "Let him try. It'll be quick." Emmett heard this. He was close enough to hear it, and he heard it, and he gave no indication that he had heard it. He stopped the Fordson at the top of the embankment and got down from the seat and walked down the embankment in his rubber boots, the same way Chuck Radcliffe had walked it on Wednesday, and he spent about 10 minutes down there in the mud doing things that were not entirely visible from the road. He was digging with a short-handled spade around the front axle of the truck. He was not digging it out. He was doing something more specific than that, cutting channels in the mud in a particular pattern around the front axle and the front differential housing. When he came back up the embankment, his boots were coated to the knee, and he was carrying the spade, and he looked satisfied in the way that a man looks satisfied when something is the way he expected it to be. He went to the Fordson and began rigging the chains. Let me tell you about how he rigged them, because the rigging is the whole story. He did not attach the chain to the truck's frame and run it back to the tractor's drawbar. That was what every other piece of equipment had done, and it had failed every time, because it was asking the machine's power to overcome the mud suction in a single direct pull, and the mud suction was greater than any machine on that site could produce. What Emmett did instead was run his chain from the truck's front axle housing, up the embankment at an angle, through a snatch block he had bolted to a section of oak timber he'd sunk into the solid ground at the road edge, and back down to a second attachment point on the truck's rear axle. He had effectively created a block and tackle arrangement using the truck's own frame as the lower block, with the snatch block at the top acting as the upper pulley. The mechanical advantage this created did not increase his drawbar pull by doubling it. It changed the direction of the force. Instead of pulling the truck horizontally toward the road, the chain geometry was pulling it upward and forward simultaneously, breaking the suction from below rather than fighting it from the side. The channels he had cut in the mud around the front axle were not random. They were relief cuts, designed to let air and water into the void beneath the frame as the truck began to move, preventing the suction from rebuilding as the load shifted. Chuck Radcliffe had stopped talking. He was watching the rigging with his arms crossed and his head slightly tilted, and there was something in his expression that had not been there before, which was attention. Real attention, the kind that comes when a man who knows his trade sees something he hasn't seen before and is trying to work out whether it will work. Emmett climbed back onto the Fordson and sat for a moment with his hands on the throttle and the clutch. The engine was chuffing steadily, not fast, not urgent, just running the way it always ran. He looked down the embankment at the truck and he looked at the chain geometry, and he made one small adjustment to the angle of the snatch block, tapping the timber with a mallet 3 times until the block was where he wanted it. Then he sat back on the seat and engaged the clutch and let the throttle out to about 3/4. The Fordson's steel lug wheels bit into the gravel at the road edge. The chain went tight. Not suddenly, not with a jerk, but gradually, the way a bow goes tight when you draw it, the slack coming out link by link until the whole system was under tension. For a long moment, nothing seemed to happen. The engine note changed, deepening, the governor cutting in and out as the load came on, the exhaust stack sending short, hard puffs of smoke into the cold air. The chains were rigid. The snatch block was rigid. The truck in the mud was still. Then, and this is the part that people who were there talked about for years afterward, the mud around the front axle of the truck made a sound, not a crack, not a pop, a long, low, wet exhalation, like the earth itself sighing, and the front axle of the truck rose. Not much, 1/2 inch, maybe 3/4, but it rose. And as it rose, the air and water Emmett had prepared for with his relief cuts moved into the void beneath the frame, and the suction that had held the truck against 20,000 pounds of winch pull and a D6 dozer and 3 days of professional effort broke. The Fordson's wheels had not spun. They were turning slowly, steadily, the lugs finding purchase in the gravel, and the truck was moving. Not fast, not dramatically. It was moving at the pace of something being born, which is to say slowly and with enormous effort, and with the sense that stopping was not an option. 2 feet, 5 feet. The rear axle broke free with a sound like a rifle shot and a spray of black mud that reached the road shoulder. 8 feet. The front wheels of the truck, still buried, began to drag forward through the mud, and the channels Emmett had cut were doing exactly what he'd designed them to do, letting the mud fold away rather than compress ahead of the moving frame. 12 feet. Chuck Radcliffe had uncrossed his arms. His hands were at his sides. He was watching the truck move with the expression of a man who is revising something fundamental about what he believes is possible. Merv Sievert had taken his cap off and was holding it in both hands. The two men who had come with Chuck from Webster City were standing at the road edge, and one of them said something under his breath that was not quite a word. 15 feet. The front wheels of the truck reached the base of the embankment where the ground began to firm up, and the Fordson's pace, which had been steady and slow, did not change. Emmett had not touched the throttle. He had not touched the clutch. He was sitting on the seat of the tractor with his hands resting on his knees, watching the chain over his shoulder, and his face had the expression of a man watching something he had already seen in his mind and was now confirming with his eyes. 20 feet. The front axle cleared the drainage ditch at the base of the embankment. 25 feet. The truck was on the slope now, the embankment giving it angle, and the Fordson's pace increased slightly as the geometry shifted and the load lightened. 30 feet. The truck came over the lip of the road shoulder at 9:47 in the morning, which was 47 minutes after Emmett Gustafson had started the Fordson's engine. It came over the lip, trailing black mud and creek water and a smell of deep earth, and its front wheels touched the gravel of the county road, and the weight of it settled onto solid ground, and Emmett brought the Fordson to a stop and sat for a moment with the engine idling. The truck sat on the county road, muddy and damaged but whole, all four wheels on solid ground, the frame intact, the cab intact, the grain box still attached and still holding most of its corn. The salvage operation that 3 days of professional effort had declared impossible had taken Emmett Gustafson 47 minutes. The two men from Webster City started clapping, not the polite applause of men being gracious in defeat, the involuntary clapping of men who have just seen something that surprised them completely, the kind that starts before you've decided to do it. Merv Sievert put his cap back on, and then took it off again and said something that was half a laugh and half a word he probably shouldn't have said on a county road. Dale Prescott was standing at the road edge with both hands pressed flat against his cheeks, and he was not saying anything at all. Chuck Radcliffe walked over to the Fordson. Emmett had shut the engine down and was climbing off the seat, and Chuck waited for him to get his feet on the ground before he spoke. He said, "I've been pulling vehicles for 20 years. He said, "I have never seen that rigging before." He said, "Where did you learn that?" Emmett looked at the chain and the snatch block and the timber, and then looked at Chuck. He said, "My father used a block and block to move a barn foundation in 1911. He said, the principle is the same. He said, you were trying to pull the truck. I was trying to change what direction the mud was holding it." Chuck said, "I understand that now." He said, "I didn't understand it before." Emmett nodded. He said, "Most people don't." He said it without any satisfaction in his voice, which made it worse for Chuck and better for everyone else. Dale Prescott came over and tried to shake Emmett's hand, and then tried to pay him, and Emmett declined both. He said the truck was blocking his view of the creek and it was bothering him. He said it with a straight face, and Dale laughed. The first time Dale had laughed in 4 days, and it came out of him like something that had been under pressure. Emmett began unhooking his chains from the truck's axles, working methodically, coiling the chain the way he always coiled it, and Dale stood there watching him and said, "What do I owe you?" Emmett said, "Nothing." Dale said, "I can't let you do this for nothing." Emmett said, "You can, and you will." He said, "If you want to do something, take a load of corn over to the church in Eldora. They're collecting for the families up in the flood district." Dale said he would do that. He did do that. that same afternoon, once the truck had been assessed and found drivable, which it was. Chuck Radcliffe drove back to Webster City that afternoon and canceled the crane. He told the story of the Fordson and the snatch block to everyone who would listen for the next several years, not as a story about being shown up, but as a story about a principle he hadn't understood and now did. He changed how he rigged loads in soft ground. He started carrying a snatch block in his truck. He told his men about the relief cuts in the mud and why they worked. He became, in his way, a student of what Emmett Gustafson had shown him, which is the best thing you can say about a man who has been proven wrong. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because the story doesn't end on that county road in October of 1951. Emmett Gustafson farmed his 280 acres for 11 more years until 1962, when his heart gave out in the middle of a June morning while he was cultivating corn. He was 78 years old. The obituary in the Eldora newspaper mentioned his years of farming and his membership in the Lutheran Church and his surviving family, and it did not mention the Fordson or the truck or the morning on the county road, because the man who wrote the obituary didn't know about it, and Emmett would not have mentioned it himself. The Fordson went to his son Gerald, who had come back from Waterloo after Emmett's death to take over the farm. Gerald was not a sentimental man about machinery, but he was a practical one, and he kept the Fordson because it started when nothing else would start and ran when nothing else would run, and because there was something about the way it was built that rewarded patience in a way that the newer machines did not. He used it for light work around the farmstead, for running the grain auger, for pulling stuck vehicles out of the lane after wet springs. He maintained it the way his father had maintained it, which was carefully and with an understanding of what each part was doing and why. In the spring of 1968, a young man named Dale Prescott Jr. drove his father's grain truck off the shoulder of the same county road, in almost the same location, on a wet April morning, when the shoulder had gone soft after a week of rain. The younger Prescott had taken over his father's hauling business when the elder Dale had retired, and he was 30 years old and had been driving grain trucks since he was 16, and he was embarrassed and frustrated and standing on the road shoulder trying to figure out what to do when Gerald Gustafson drove past in his pickup and stopped. Gerald looked at the truck in the ditch. He looked at the younger Prescott. He said, "I've got a Fordson and some logging chains. I think I can get that out." Dale Jr. looked at him. He said, "That old gray tractor?" Gerald said, "That's the one." Dale Jr. said, "You sure?" Gerald said, "My father pulled your father's truck out of this same ditch with that tractor 17 years ago." He said it without drama, just as a fact, and Dale Jr. stood there for a moment absorbing the fact and then said, "All right, let's try it." Gerald backed the Fordson down from the farmstead, the same engine chuffing in the spring air, the same steel lug wheels ringing on the gravel, the same logging chains clanking behind. He rigged it the way his father had rigged it, with the snatch block and the timber and the relief cuts, because his father had shown him how it was done and had explained why it worked, and Gerald had listened the way a son listens when he understands that his father is telling him something important. The truck came out in 53 minutes, which was 6 minutes longer than it had taken Emmett, and Gerald thought his father would have had something to say about that, though he couldn't be sure what. Dale Jr. shook Gerald's hand and tried to pay him, and Gerald declined, the same as his father had declined, and Dale Jr. said, "Is there anything I can do?" Gerald said, "There's a family over on the Grundy County line that lost their barn to a fire last month. They're taking donations." Dale Jr. said he'd see to it. He did. Let me tell you one last thing, because I want you to understand what the Fordson represented and what Emmett Gustafson understood about it that the professionals with their modern equipment did not. The men who came with their winches and their dozers and their hydraulic pumps were not stupid. Chuck Radcliffe was good at his job. Merv Sievert was good at his job. They had the best equipment available in 1951, and they knew how to use it. What they didn't have was what Emmett had, which was an understanding of the specific problem in front of them rather than the general category of problem they thought they were looking at. They saw a stuck truck, and they applied stuck truck solutions. Emmett saw a truck held by suction in saturated silt, and he applied a solution designed for that specific condition, using the mechanical advantage of a system that changed the direction of force, rather than simply increasing its magnitude. The Fordson's 10 horsepower was not the point. The point was where the force was going and what it was doing when it got there. That is the difference between power and understanding. You can have all the power in the world and apply it in the wrong direction and accomplish nothing. You can have very little power and apply it precisely and move something that nothing else could move. Emmett Gustafson knew this because he had spent 50 years solving problems on 280 acres with whatever was at hand. And the problems of a farm do not wait for you to have the right equipment. They require you to think about what you have and what the problem actually is, not what it looks like. The Fordson Model F that Emmett bought in 1929 for $395 is still on the Gustafson farm in Hardin County. Gerald's son Raymond has it now, and Raymond has kept it running the same way his grandfather kept it running, with attention and patience and a willingness to understand how the machine works, rather than simply expecting it to work. Raymond is not a collector. He doesn't show the tractor at fairs or polish it for display. He uses it. Not often, but when the situation calls for it, which is a few times a year, and it starts when he needs it to start and runs when he needs it to run, which is all you can ask of anything. There are people who would look at that tractor and see a relic, something that should have been retired decades ago, replaced by something newer and more capable. Those people are not wrong about the newer machines. The newer machines are more capable in almost every measurable way. But measurable ways are not the only ways. Emmett Gustafson knew something about that tractor that no specification sheet could capture, which was exactly what it could do and exactly how to make it do it. And that knowledge was worth more on that October morning in 1951 than all the horsepower in Hardin County. Some problems don't need more power. They need someone who understands the problem well enough to know what kind of power to apply and where and in what direction. Emmett Gustafson understood that. He understood it the way men understand things they've learned through decades of quiet attention to how the world actually works rather than how they've been told it works. And on a Tuesday morning in October, with a professional salvage operator standing on the road above him, saying it couldn't be done, he went down into the mud and cut his relief channels and rigged his chains and climbed onto his 1929 Fordson and showed everyone present what understanding looks like when it's put to work. The Fordson is still there. Raymond keeps the oil changed and the magneto clean and the carburetor adjusted. And the experts who see it parked in the machine should sometimes ask him why he keeps the old thing around when there are better options available. Raymond tells them it's a good tractor. He doesn't usually explain further. He figures if they have to ask, the explanation would take longer than either of them has time for. That's what happens when you underestimate something that was built to last by a man who understood what lastin' means, and kept by men who understood what their father left them and why it was worth keeping, and used on the one morning when everything else had failed and the mud had won and the professionals had packed up and gone, and a 67-year-old farmer in a canvas jacket came down his lane with 10 horsepower and 50 years of patience and moved what 20,000 pounds of line pull could not.